It was the kind of evening that's supposed to feel warm. Shared wine, flickering candles, people who've known each other too long to keep up formalities. Our dining room buzzed with soft laughter and the kind of conversation that slides easily from gossip to confessions. I was midway through my second glass when the question came, light and unassuming. "So what have you been working on lately?" Melissa, one of her coworkers, asked me with that casual friendliness that only feels innocent until you answer. I smiled, maybe too genuinely, and leaned forward slightly. "I've been sketching out something I shelved a few years ago, a concept for a creative studio. Something independent. Design, brand work, media strategy. My own thing." There was a pause, a polite one. Then laughter, soft, but not kind. "He still thinks he's going to be some visionary," my wife said, not even looking at me. "It's cute." And that was it. No punchline. Just a dismissal wrapped in a smile, like she was handing out favors. The table chuckled the way people do when they don't know whether they're laughing with someone or at someone. I felt it before I processed it, the heat climbing behind my ears, the tightening in my jaw. Except one person didn't laugh. Erika, her friend from college, the one who never came to these things unless specifically invited. She glanced down at her glass and said nothing. That silence cut through the rest of the room like a seam ripper through thread. I forced a smile. Said something about just playing with ideas. No big plans. Nothing serious. The dinner rolled on. Plates passed. Wine poured. Conversation drifted away from me like I wasn't there. I nodded where needed. Laughed once, maybe twice. But something in me had snapped quiet, like a fuse that burns out silently and leaves the room looking the same, but colder. Later I would remember her tone more than her words. The way she spoke like she'd forgotten I could hear her. The effortless nature of it. Not cruel, just entirely certain that what I'd said didn't matter. That night, after everyone had gone and she was stacking dishes, she asked, "You okay?" I said, "Fine." She didn't press. She never did. I stayed in the kitchen a little longer than needed, just enough to let the silence harden. And as I turned off the lights, one voice came back to me, not hers, but Erika's, quiet and unmistakable as she sipped her wine after the laughter faded. "Honestly? You should go for it." I heard that line in my head louder than anything else that night. Because it didn't sound like support. It sounded like rescue. I didn't bring it up that night. Didn't ask if she meant it as a joke, or if she noticed I hadn't laughed. I knew the answer to both. She meant it. And no, she hadn't noticed. That's the part that stayed with me. I lay on the couch instead of climbing into bed beside her. No dramatic storm out, no slammed doors. Just a quiet decision, the kind you make without words. She didn't come out to ask why. Didn't call my name. I could hear her brushing her teeth, scrolling through her phone, the familiar hum of her nightly routine continuing undisturbed, as if I were a roommate she barely remembered sharing space with. And maybe that was exactly what we had become. It wasn't about the comment itself. Not really. It was what lived underneath it. Years of veiled critiques, of jokes, that always landed just a little too precisely. She had a way of making doubt feel like concern. Like when I'd first mentioned the studio idea years ago and she'd said, "I love that you still have big dreams, it's kind of adorable." Like ambition was a phase. Something I'd grow out of, like band posters or vintage sneakers. But this? Saying it in front of people? That was something else. That was a public subtraction. Like she was rewriting who I was while I was still in the room. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, the silence around me thick, too full of things unsaid. I thought of all the times I'd edited myself to avoid that tone of hers, the faint, amused superiority. How many ideas had I swallowed? How many sentences had I never finished? At some point I scrolled back through my old files, folders I hadn't opened in years, logos I'd designed, frameworks I'd written for companies that never existed. Notes scribbled late at night on paper napkins and scanned into PDFs because I believed they mattered. I reread them like they belonged to someone else. Someone I used to be. Someone who hadn't yet learned to be small around her. She never came out to the living room. Never asked if something was wrong. And that told me more than 100 apologies ever could. The next morning, I made coffee before she woke up, left it on the counter, said nothing. When she came in, she asked if I'd had trouble sleeping. I just smiled and said, "Nah, couch was fine." And maybe that was true. Because for the first time in a long time, I was starting to feel the shape of the wound. And more importantly, I was starting to understand exactly where it had come from. I began waking before the sun, not from insomnia, but intention. It started as restlessness, the kind that doesn't scream, but hums beneath your skin until you move. The first few mornings I ran. Not fast, not far. Just enough to feel something click back into place. The streets were empty, sky still dim, and I liked it that way. The silence felt earned. Clean. She noticed, of course. She always noticed changes, just never asked the right questions. Early morning phase again? She said once, yawning as I came back through the door. I just nodded and grabbed a towel. She didn't press. She never did, not when it mattered. I stopped talking about ideas, about anything that mattered to me. It wasn't spite, just clarity. She had made it clear what she thought of my ambitions, and I had finally learned to stop offering them up like gifts she could mock. Instead, I turned inward. I pulled out an old notebook I'd kept in a box in the garage, filled with sketches, mind maps, even a rough pitch deck. Pages curled, ink faded, but the bones were strong. The ideas still held. I began to rewrite them. Not for her. Not for anyone's approval. Just to remember what it felt like to take myself seriously. One night while she was out with friends, I reactivated a domain I'd bought 7 years ago. The name still made sense. Still felt right. I logged in, updated the registrar, and saw the message, "Your site is live again." It was a small thing, but it felt seismic. That week, I started reaching out to a few old contacts, not broadcasting anything. Just quiet emails, curious feelers. I didn't mention it at dinner, didn't test the waters with her like I used to. I wasn't looking for support anymore. I was looking for traction. And Erika, the friend who didn't laugh, messaged me 3 days later. "Hey, about the other night." I wasn't laughing. I meant what I said. I stared at the message longer than I should have. It was simple, but it felt like someone had thrown a rope across a canyon I hadn't realized I'd been standing beside. For a brief second, I imagined replying with something witty, or grateful, or guarded. Instead, I just typed, "I know. Thank you." I didn't tell my wife about it. Didn't mention Erika at all. I wasn't hiding it out of guilt, just protecting something that finally felt real again. And as I sat there that night, working late while she scrolled on her phone across the room, something inside me began to settle. Not peace. Not yet, but direction. There's a moment, not a single event, but a gradual erosion, when you stop turning towards someone. When a shared life becomes two parallel lines. Ours hit that point somewhere between her second snide comment that week and the 5th time I deleted something before she could read over my shoulder. "Don't you think you should be a little more realistic?" she said on a Thursday night, barely looking up from her emails. I said nothing. Just minimized the window with my sketches and reopened an old spreadsheet, not because I needed it, but because I knew what she wanted to see. Numbers, schedules, order. Proof I wasn't wasting time with ideas that made me feel alive. She thought she was offering guidance. What she was really doing was placing a ceiling over my head, low enough that I'd eventually forget to stand tall. So I stopped showing her. I stopped asking what she thought. Stopped testing the temperature of her mood before opening my mouth. I didn't announce the small wins anymore. The logo that got accepted by a startup founder on LinkedIn, the branding call that went surprisingly well. I gave her my silence, and in return, she gave me space. But space isn't always absence. Sometimes it's the air you finally breathe when someone stops crowding your voice. I found new places to speak, people who actually listened. A forum thread turned into a coffee Zoom with a design director. A DM became a project brief. Nothing life-changing yet, but enough to remind me that I hadn't made all this up, that there was still value in what I could build. And then there was Erika. She messaged again after seeing a post I'd made, vague but hopeful, something about finally dusting off a long-ignored project. She replied, "About time." We met for coffee the next week. Neutral ground. No agendas. She didn't flinch when I told her how long I'd buried this dream. Didn't ask why. Just said, "So what's stopping you now?" That's when she told me about a contact of hers, someone building a boutique brand from the ground up, looking for a creative partner. She said she could make an intro if I was serious. "I am," I told her, maybe too quickly. She smiled like she already knew that. When I got home, my wife asked if I'd picked up dish soap. I had, but I forgot it in the car. She rolled her eyes and went back to chopping vegetables. I watched her for a moment, and felt the split more clearly than ever. Two lives. 2 tempos. 2 languages. She had no idea what had just shifted, and I didn't feel the need to explain. The coffee with Erika wasn't just a meeting, it was a recalibration. She didn't look at me like a man in crisis. She looked at me like someone resurfacing, someone worth talking to again. She brought a printed mock-up of the project, sleek, ambitious, full of texture and sharp angles. "They're still in early stages," she said, her tone calm but deliberate. "But they're looking for someone who can help shape the identity from scratch." I studied it while she spoke, nodding, questions forming, real ones, the kind I hadn't asked anyone in years. I hadn't realized how starved I was for a conversation like this until it was happening. "What made you think of me?" I finally asked. Erika didn't hesitate. "Because I remember what you were working on before you started shelving your work. And because I watched her laugh when she should have backed you." The silence after that wasn't awkward, it was heavy, but earned. We didn't talk about my wife beyond that. Erika wasn't trying to fix anything. She just gave me a name, an email, and a sentence I hadn't heard in years. "Tell them what you do best." I drove home with the folder in the passenger seat, glancing at it every time I stopped at a light. It felt like a passport to a place I used to live, one I hadn't realized I missed until someone handed me directions back. That night, I submitted a mock proposal. Nothing polished, just intention made visible. When I hit send, my hand hovered over the trackpad longer than I wanted to admit. It felt reckless. It felt necessary. I didn't tell my wife. She was on the couch, watching something brightly lit and aggressively cheerful. She asked how the coffee was. "Productive," I said. She smirked slightly. "That friend of mine, she's still single?" I just shrugged and went to the kitchen, hands suddenly too tense to answer. I read her comment too many ways: casual, curious, sarcastic, testing. But I let it pass. I wasn't there to interpret anymore. 2 days later, I got a response from the brand Erika had mentioned. They wanted a virtual pitch, a short one. 20 minutes, show direction, vision, flexibility. They liked the tone of my write-up, wanted to hear more. When I told Erika, she didn't send back emojis or platitudes, just this: "Go make them see it." For the first time in a long while, I felt like someone did. The pitch went better than expected. They asked sharp questions, not to poke holes, but to understand. When I finished, one of them said, "This doesn't feel like your first time doing this." I smiled, a little too tightly. It wasn't, just the first time anyone had asked in years. That night, I sat in the living room with my laptop still warm on my thighs, adrenaline still cooling in my chest. My wife walked in halfway through an email I was drafting, a follow-up, carefully worded but quietly confident. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Is this your midlife reinvention or something?" she asked, voice light, detached. "Because if it is, I hope it's brief." She said it like someone flipping through a magazine. Not cruel, just careless, thoughtless. The kind of line you don't say unless you've long since stopped viewing the person across from you as someone who feels. I didn't flinch, didn't laugh, didn't respond. I just closed my laptop. Not out of anger, but because I knew, in that moment, something final had happened. She walked past me into the kitchen. I heard the fridge open, the soft clink of a bottle being moved, the hum of domestic noise. The kind that usually dulls emotion, makes you second-guess what just happened. But not this time. That one line cut clean through years of compromise, of taking small wounds and pretending they didn't leave a mark. I realized I wasn't waiting for her to understand anymore. I was done handing her pieces of myself, and watching her play with them like puzzles she never intended to finish. That night, I lay in bed beside her, staring at the ceiling, and I knew I wasn't going to keep handing over parts of my soul to someone who treated it like a side project she never asked for. She fell asleep quickly, phone still glowing beside her, casting soft light across her cheek. She looked peaceful, comfortable. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. I was finished. There's a difference. She left on a Sunday morning for what she called a wellness retreat, a weekend in the mountains with yoga, green juice, and her closest friends. The kind of thing she always came back from a little smugger than she left. I kissed her cheek like nothing was wrong. Helped load her bag into the trunk. She reminded me to water the basil plant. The moment her car turned the corner, I stood at the doorway for a long beat. Then I turned and walked straight to the closet. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rushed. I packed only what mattered, essentials, a few books, my drives files, some clothes. The hard-won fragments of myself I'd slowly rebuilt in silence. I left behind the clutter, the curated furniture she'd picked to match the color palette of a life that had no room for my voice. I moved with a clarity I hadn't known I was capable of. No hesitation. No nostalgia. The keys I'd kept on a hook by the door, house, mailbox, garage, I laid on the counter in a neat row. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, letting the stillness sink in. I thought about writing a note, something clean, civil. But I knew she'd twist the wording, turn it into something theatrical, make it sound like I was just trying to stir drama or gain sympathy. So I left nothing. No explanation. Just absence. Because silence, real, unmistakable silence, is the only thing she never learned how to interrupt. I didn't answer my phone for the next 24 hours. Didn't check my texts. I drove to a temporary space I'd quietly arranged the week before. A short-term rental, just mine. Sparse. Undecorated. It felt like walking into a room built entirely out of oxygen. I sat on the floor that first night with a takeout box on one side, my laptop on the other, and an empty wall ahead of me. And for the first time in years, I felt something more than just free. I felt present. The next morning, I turned the phone back on. No missed calls yet, just texts, short ones. Hey, you home? And then, hours later. Everything okay? I didn't respond. By the end of the day, her tone changed. This is ridiculous. You're not making a point. Still, I said nothing. Because I wasn't trying to make a point. I was making a life. By Monday night, the silence had turned into noise, just not from me. It started with a flurry of confused texts, not from her, but from mutual acquaintances, friends we'd hosted for dinner. Co-workers she claimed were his friends too, the ones who'd laughed politely when she joked at my expense. Hey, someone said you're presenting tonight? At that branding event? You moved out. What's going on? She must have seen the same messages. Her silence broke not with a call, she knew better, but with a string of increasingly tight, performative texts. Why is everyone asking if you left? Are you trying to embarrass me? Then, finally, this is dramatic. That one, I didn't just ignore. I deleted it unread. The event that night wasn't large, maybe 40 people in a modest venue with exposed brick and folding chairs. But it mattered. It was the first time in years I stood in front of strangers and said something real about what I built. Not what I used to do, not what I failed to start, but what I was actively building. And she wasn't there to minimize it. Erika was, though. She sat near the back, not smiling too much, not clapping too loud, just present. Like she had been the whole time, steady, not savior. After the short talk, a few people came up to ask questions, compliment the direction, hand me their cards. It wasn't fame. It wasn't a triumph. But it was something she'd never given me. Recognition without condition. I left the venue with no urgency. The summer air was still, the kind that makes city streets feel paused between decisions. I turned off my phone entirely, walked 2 extra blocks just to feel anonymous a little longer. Back at the apartment, I set my things down and stared out the window for a long time. Her name hovered in my message history like a leftover bruise. She had posted photos that day, smiling at a juice bar, arms around friends, captions about clarity and wellness. Like nothing had shifted. Like silence was a phase she expected me to end. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't yet understand, was that I hadn't gone quiet to punish her. I had gone quiet because I finally realized I didn't need her permission to speak. And I wasn't coming back. She tried to keep the narrative intact, at first. Posted selfies from mountaintop trails with vague captions about renewal. A story highlight reel of lavender fields and wellness platitudes. But beneath the filters, something frayed. I didn't see it directly. I wasn't watching her stories. But people started telling me. Mutual friends, old colleagues. Not gossip. Just quiet observations. Everything okay with you too? She seems off lately. I'd answer with a neutral nod. Things are changing. And they were. Just not the way she wanted them to. She started sending longer messages. Not apologies, not exactly. Just attempts to reclaim control through confusion. I'm just trying to understand what this is. You never said anything was wrong. I thought we were fine. That one made me pause. Fine. That word. The same one she'd used to smooth over every offhand insult. Every dinner where I went quiet. Every morning I left for a run instead of making conversation. We weren't fine. We were quietly eroding, and she mistook the absence of conflict for harmony. But harmony doesn't mock you at dinner, and it doesn't call your purpose a phase. Meanwhile, Erika, without pushing, started publicly supporting my work. She reposted a clip from the event with a simple caption, "Proud to know this voice." That post did more than she knew. It rippled. People started associating me with something independent, something mine. Not hers. Not ours. Just mine. I knew the moment she saw it, because the next day, the tone of her messages changed. "This is really how you want to be seen?" Just walking away like I was never part of this. There it was, the unraveling. She wasn't confused. She was threatened. Not by my departure, but by what came next. By the possibility that the version of me she had minimized might be rising without her. And worse, that the people who once laughed with her were now leaning in to listen to me. By the end of the week, a friend of hers, one who'd chuckled politely at that dinner, sent me a message I didn't expect. "You ever need a designer? I'd love to collaborate. I didn't know you were actually building something." That's the part she never understood. She thought the dream was a punchline. Turns out, it was a launch pad. And now she was watching the countdown from the wrong side of the glass. I wasn't chasing reinvention. I was just reclaiming what I'd let atrophy. And now, it was growing faster than I expected. The project Erika connected me to? It turned into a full contract. Then another. Small businesses, early-stage founders, even a non-profit with a story worth telling. They didn't care what I'd done 5 years ago. They cared about what I could see now, what I could help them build. And for the first time in a long time, I felt useful without needing to be loud. It wasn't about revenge. I wasn't out to prove her wrong. The truth was simpler, and sharper. I was done letting her define me by who I wasn't. There were no declarations, no status updates. Just action. I leased a small shared office downtown, a quiet place with high ceilings and a window that let in light I didn't have to apologize for. I put my name on the glass, just a small decal. Subtle. But it was mine. Erika came by one afternoon to drop off some materials. She stood in the middle of the room, spun once slowly, and said, "Feels right, doesn't it?" I nodded. It did. We didn't flirt. We didn't complicate it. We worked. She believed in the work. That was enough. Back on the other side of the city, my wife was still trying to maintain a version of the story that made sense, to her followers, to whatever image she was curating now. But behind closed doors, things shifted. The dinner invitations slowed. The curated brunches became more sparse. Friends started reaching out to me directly, not to take sides, but to be part of something that finally felt like it had direction. Because the strange thing about building something real? People recognize it. And they want to be near it. Even people who used to laugh. She never said it directly. But I saw it in the way she stopped posting for a while. The way her captions grew shorter, less certain. I was no longer a subplot in her life. I was the part she hadn't seen coming. And that's what she never understood. She spent years placing limits on who I could be. Ceilings, edits, quiet mockery. But dreams don't vanish when someone doubts them. They just wait for you to walk out the door. The email came on a Wednesday afternoon, buried under newsletters and client updates. Her name in my inbox felt both foreign and familiar, like finding a letter in handwriting you used to know by heart. The subject line was blank. I hovered for a moment, then clicked. It wasn't long. No apology. Just confusion. "I don't understand why you didn't say anything. If you were this unhappy, why not talk to me? Why just leave?" There was something raw about the message, but it wasn't vulnerability. It was disbelief. Not that I left, but that I had the audacity to do it without making it about her. She thought leaving required permission, or theatrics, or at least one final conversation where she could reframe the narrative. But the truth was simple. I had said plenty. In the silences, in the couch sleeps, in every early morning run and withdrawn idea, in every version of myself I trimmed down to fit into her world. She just never listened until the silence became permanent. I didn't reply. Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because there was nothing left to explain. That weekend, I spoke at a small creative summit. Nothing flashy. Folding chairs, exposed wood beams, a mix of nervous energy and caffeine. My segment was called Rediscovered Purpose. I almost laughed when they introduced me that way. But when I stood there, slides behind me, room full of faces watching, listening, I didn't feel like a fraud. I told the truth. Not about her. Not about how it all fell apart. Just about what it means to bury your own voice under years of practicality, and what it takes to dig it back out again. Afterward, someone asked if I had any advice for someone starting late. I said, "It's never too late to stop living small. Just make sure when you leave all the way." Later that night, I sat on the apartment floor with a warm drink, laptop closed, lights low. No applause, no messages waiting, just quiet, but not the kind she left behind. This one felt earned. She had mocked the dream, and now she was watching it unfold from the outside, and I was no longer waiting for her to notice. I already had.